Well, friend of the show and numerical boffin, Jamie Jenkins, who's an independent statistician and political commentator, joins me now. Jamie, should we trust the modelling? Should we trust the science and be taking decisions from that? Or should we be far keener to look into what's going into those calculations and perhaps be a little bit wary of basing too many decisions on it?
Yeah, Alex, I think that obviously you need to have some plan for some scenario. It's the same with the weather. You know, you've got weather models that the Met Office will run to kind of look at what's happening at the moment, what's happened recently, to kind of tell us what's going to be happening on Christmas Day. Are we going to get any snow for Christmas Day? And it's a similar thing, really, with when you're trying to predict pandemics, because you've kind of got what data is happening at the moment, what have we learned from the past, what can we predict in the future. But I think the difficulty we've had with the SAGE modelling and Professor Neil Ferguson themselves is that many times the models that they've been coming up with and the numbers they've been coming up with, when you then, because the good thing with scenarios, you get to mark the homework in a way. And think back to September, we were told by SAGE if England didn't bring in Plan B restrictions, we would get potentially up to 7,000 hospitalisations a day in England. Obviously, Boris didn't bring in Plan B restrictions. Now, the 7,000 was the upper limit, but they said 2,000 to 7,000. So that was the range that they came up with. What actually happened? It was closer to 700, 1/10 of the worst case scenario. So Boris didn't follow the SAGE advice then, and we didn't end up with a catastrophic outcome than what SAGE was saying. So we've had this constantly in the past now where Neil Ferguson originally was predicting 500,000 deaths. He's been predicting 5,000 Omicron deaths have been talked about. And I think it was on the Breakfast Show a couple of days ago talking about the kind of how nonsense those facts and figures were as well. So it's difficult to, it's like the boy who cried wolf. There could be a time where SAGE comes up with the bang on kind of metric to what we want. But when they're so wrong all of the time, can you trust it?
I suppose you can't blame a government for being risk averse, though, because the same Neil Ferguson said that he believes now, latterly, retrospectively, if the government had locked down a week earlier, at the very start of this pandemic, so back when the borders were shutting and continental Europe was largely locking down, that he thinks that there would have been half the deaths that we finally saw. I mean, that's a big change based upon a delay of just 7 days. Do you think with Boris Johnson announcing just then at 5 o'clock that Christmas isn't cancelled, we can all go ahead with our plans as normal, that this is a political decision that could end up having terrible consequences? Are you quite comfortable that rather than constantly go towards the worst case scenario, that the government are finally learning to balance this out with societal needs and economic needs?
Well, on the front of the Daily Mail last 27th of December, we were told 15 million jabs to freedom. Now we're currently, Alex, on 128 million jabs now. So, 8.5 times as many vaccinations have been dished out. Now, what Boris and the other First Ministers across the UK are banking on is the booster rollout to kind of get extra antibodies in the population. Not a bad thing, I suppose, there. And they've sped up the actual booster rollout. But if you look now at this time last year, and people who are going into hospital, 70% of all the hospital admissions with COVID were 65 and over in terms of age. And we know this is a virus that attacks the elderly. Now, let's look at the actual statistics today. 87% of people who are 65 and over in England have had a booster jab. And it's even up to like in the high 90s when you look at 75 to 79-year-olds. So the most vulnerable people have already had a booster. Now, if the government's banking everything on the booster, and the evidence coming out of South Africa and Denmark is this is a much less kind of deadly virus, then there is no real evidence to kind of go into a lockdown, because where are all these hospitalizations going to come from that SAGE are talking about if the majority of people who may be the ones who end up in hospital have already had the booster? You're not going to see 18, 19, 20-year-olds rocking up in ICU without having a booster, only with 2 jabs, probably not even vaccinated, because that's the way the virus works. So I think Boris has probably made the right decision at this point. What we see after Christmas, there's obviously a split in cabinet, and we'll see what he comes up with in the next few days, I suppose.
Do you think Sage have been transparent enough with publishing not only their findings, and we often have Chris Whitty standing there in front of the big screen saying, next slide, please, and showing us a whole load of impenetrable graphs and spreadsheets. And we go along and we nod and we say, yes, yes, he's a boffin. He knows more than we do. He's showing us bits and bobs and graphicating worst case scenarios. So obviously we trust this. But what we're not seeing are the discussions going on between the policy unit and the modellers to determine quite what they're modelling and how. How significant is that? And do you think the Sage has been transparent enough?
Well, they've released the minutes, I think, of the meetings, and they are more transparent than they are in Wales, in terms of what goes on with the modellers. I've never really looked at Scotland. I think the difficulty you have, I think in part is driven by kind of a lot of the media channels. GB News actually hasn't been driving a lot of this, but a few weeks ago the BBC were all over South Africa and this Omicron variant. Cases in South Africa have come down in the last 3 days, and we haven't seen this rocket jump up in kind of deaths that may have occurred in previous waves. You put the BBC News on, I watched it last night, not a mention of South Africa. Similar when we had the India variant many, many months ago, we didn't see it. And the public, my mum was phoning me last week. I was taking my dad to Newbury races, saying, should you take him because of the Omicron variant? So, well, I'm looking at the stats. I think there's a relatively low risk to go into Newbury races. The vast majority of the public are scared because of a lot of what the media report. And the media have a part to play in this, Alex, because they will normally pick up the Sage worst case scenarios. And in fairness to Sage, they do put a range in. But what gets reported by a lot of the newspapers is the worst case scenario, in particular The Guardian, who are pretty bad at doing this. And then people read that. And the problem then is, because a lot of people don't understand kind of ranges and statistical uncertainties, they see the worst case scenario and they think that's the actual scenario that's going to happen. So I think, in part, Sage could look at the probability of some of these things they're doing, but the media themselves are a part to play as well.